Hi everyone, this is Estelle Vasudevan. Welcome to another episode of the Murali Pod. I'm joined today by Nicholas Brooks and a special guest, Santokie Nagulendran. Before we get started on what we're talking about today, just a reminder to everyone who's listening or watching this, make sure to hit that subscribe button or follow button if you're on podcasts. We are on pretty much every major podcast platform and on YouTube as well. And we also have a newsletter. So if you're interested in getting some written insights, please follow us. We've got all the links in the description box below. Um, uh, I know a lot of Sri Lankans watching this or who follow us are probably not wanting to be thinking about cricket at this moment, um, because the men's team has just as we're recording, has been knocked out of the T20 World Cup. But don't run away yet. We're talking about the women today who've got a series against the West Indies coming up at home. They've got three ODIs and three T20s. And that's why we've got Santoki with us. If you don't know him, which is, it would be strange if you did follow a lot of cricket podcasts and you didn't know who he is. He's one half of the hugely popular Caribbean cricket podcast. So we're sure to get a lot of great insight on the West Indies team today. Uh, just before we get into the women's series, Santoki, I have to ask you, right?
Hmm.
The West Indies are back. How does it feel to be one of the first teams into the Super 8s this time?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I feel pretty tired. I've been up all night in England watching West Indies get the iconic victory over New Zealand. And yeah, as you said, West Indies are back. Home World Cup. Hopefully, we can push forward in the Super 8s and Darren Sammy take us to glory in the final at the Kensington Oval, which would be a dream and sort of reinvigorate, that love for cricket again in the region. We've had some down bad moments over the past few years, so this would be great to lift that T20 World Cup at home.
Yeah, I mean, West Indies is one of those, second favorite teams for a lot of people watching. So I'm sure a lot of the guys and girls who are listening or watching would be backing them to go far in this tournament. Now we're coming to the women's series. West Indies are coming into this after a pretty huge series win against Pakistan, right? Um, what do you think the feeling around the camp is coming into a pretty important series?
Yeah, I think as you said, rightly said, it's an important series. We've just come off a clean sweep away in Pakistan, and obviously with the World Cup being held in Bangladesh, T20 World Cup, again preparing in subcontinental conditions is going to help the team massively. I think from a fan perspective, we're kind of conflicted at the moment with the women's side. On the one side, we've got Hayley Mathews, who's a once in a generation talent. Like her performances with the bat, even the ball, completely phenomenal. I think in the women's game, she walks into any international 11
Yeah.
at this point in time. So she's someone at her peak performing well. However, if you look at the rest of the side, we're very, very reliant on Matthews performing. If Matthews isn't in the side for whatever reason or isn't performing, the rest of the side you'd imagine would struggle. So again, while we appreciate what Hayley Matthews is doing for the side, it's almost as if there's almost alarm bells as to kind of where's the depth we have in this 11. And I think going to Sri Lanka is going to be a great test for us.
Yeah, on that topic, Nick, I think if you look at the two teams, it's a very similar situation, isn't it? With Sri Lanka's Hayley Mathews for West Indies is what Chamari Athapaththu is for Sri Lanka.
Totally. I mean, they're very similar sides in a way, aren't they? I think this will naturally be billed as Chamari versus Haley, two batters who I'd say each can claim to be right at the top, if not the number one batter in women's cricket. Two bowlers who like to bowl off spin in the power play. So pretty similar players, one right-hander, one left-hander, but then also quite similar sides in a way. I saw they're ranked 6th and 7 in the ODI rankings. And as Santoki touched on, they're pretty reliant on those star players with, some younger girls coming through who are kind of just taking their first steps in international cricket. I would think that West Indies maybe have slightly more depth than Sri Lanka at the moment. When you look at, they've got Stefani Taylor, don't they? Who is just a sort of level below Hayley Mathews. But I'm really excited for this series because I think it's going to be interesting to see whether some of these less well-known players take that step up, and especially two kind of pretty dynamic spin attacks who I think will both be really interesting to see what they're offering at Hambantota.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a big name that people miss when they talk about the West Indies is Stephanie Taylor, right? Sure, she's not been at her best, but she's still a world class player and can, turn a game on its head any given day, right? On the flip side, Sri Lanka do have a lot of support cast, but they don't really have another player apart from Athapaththu who can take the lead like that and deliver in a game where, that's the sole match winning performance, right? You tend to always see performances coming from Harshita Samaravikrama, Hasini Pereira, Kavisha Dilhari, but it's always kind of a support role. And Athapaththu is always, you know, either she's done well with the ball or she's done something spectacular with the bat. Um, Nick, I'm going to come back to you again just to look back on the last series Sri Lanka played. And Athapaththu is coming into this series against the West Indies after that 190 plus, right? What kind of confidence would she be bringing into this three match series?
I think that she has to be as confident as she has been at any time in her career, right? And I feel like we've really seen a progression over the last 12, 18 months where now every cricket fan, no matter where you're from in the world, knows who Chamari Athapaththu is. And so that must feel great because she's in the later stages of her career. She's talked about retirement. And really now it seems that, how old is she, Estelle? You probably know better than me, 34, 35.
34, yeah. 34.
34. And I mean, it seems like she's at her zenith, right? I don't think, I mean, you look back at everything she's done, not just in the World Cup qualifiers, but in South Africa and over the past 12 months, she's been outstanding, hasn't she? And so, yeah, I think she'll come into this full of confidence, as actually should the whole Sri Lanka team, because you look at what they did in those World Cup qualifiers, you look at what they did in South Africa, and some really, really impressive performances. So, yeah, I think we're going to see a confident Sri Lanka side, and this is a really good test for them.
Santoki, just like we've spoken about Hayley Mathews, and obviously, like Nick mentioned, right, this is going to be billed as Athapaththu versus Mathews because they've just been so phenomenal for their sides in all formats, right? They've shone above everybody else. But who are the other players we should have an eye out for, and who do you think? We spoke about, the conditions, probably spin friendly, right? Who are the players that you would be looking at to make a difference in this tournament?
Yeah, well, I think you touched on her briefly. Stephanie Taylor, still a quality batter. However, she's had back issues in recent
Mm.
times, and her form has slightly dipped. However, we saw against Pakistan, she did put together a load of runs, particularly in the second ODI. I think she scored 77 against Pakistan. So she's a quality batter, 33 years old. So similarly, she's coming towards the later part of her career. But she's someone who can start with the bat. At number 3, our vice captain as well, Shemaine Campbell. Again, very experienced, but a quality batter to have it at 3 positions. So I think if Sri Lanka will need those 3 batters at the top of the order, that's going to be key for West Indies. And it'll be interesting to see how Sri Lanka can sort of penetrate that with their spin attack. In terms of the West Indies side as well, their bowling. Funny enough, our main strengths at the moment are spin. In the pace department, we're slightly lacking. Afi Fletcher, who is the leading wicket taker in that Pakistan T20 series, leg spinner, veteran, 37 years old, knows what she's doing, confident in her game. She's going to be key. Karishma Ramnarak off spin again, alongside Hayley Mathews. And in the T20 format, we've also got youngster Kiana Joseph, who's a left arm slow spinner. So we have a lot of spinners in our attack, and that's obviously going to cause some damage in Sri Lanka. The one concern is we still will need some pacers. In that department, inconsistent. Chanel Henry and Aliyah Elena are 2 sort of main pacers, right arm mediums. However, they struggled in Pakistan to take wickets, went for a lot of runs. So I think we're going to be heavily reliant on our wicket taking ability to go through those spinners.
Yeah, that's great to hear because we don't, like I mentioned before, we don't really hear too much about the other players apart from Hayley Mathews, right? And I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to have at least a few playing that supporting role to get teams over the line, particularly in the ODI format. Just to concentrate on the ODIs, right? It's a massive series for both teams because they're still vying for uh, automatic qualification into the World Cup in 2025. West Indies, I think, are in a better state. They have 6 wins, 7 losses in 15 games, so 3 series to come. They have a big chance of going through. Sri Lanka a little lower down in that list. 18 played, 5 wins, 8 losses, and only 14 points. So all to play for both teams. Nick, what do you think Sri Lanka's main focus will be in the ODIs when it comes to, obviously they've got to tackle Hayley Mathews, and they have to, I mean, they'll be looking at performances from Chamari Athapaththu, but what are the other areas you think that they'll be focusing on?
So yeah, as Santoki touched on, I mean, I think that getting rid of those big top three is going to be a real priority, right? If you can skittle those three cheaply, then the rest should fall into place. But aside from that, I think it's going to be putting up consistently big totals, right? We've seen runs scoring quite a lot at Hammantota, and so whether they can consistently score 270 plus scores around even up around the 300 mark would be really, really promising. And also, I think that as fans, and I'm sure from the management point of view, what you really want to see is someone other than Chamari grabbing a game by the scruff of the neck and putting in a match-winning performance. So, like, we saw Vishmi Gunaratne like have a really good series, didn't we, in South Africa? Can she take that next step and score a big game-winning 100? Or Kavisha Dilhari, some of these young girls who've shown lots of promise, and as you said, Estelle, done it time and again in kind of supporting roles, but can they be the person that stands up and play the leading hand? I think that if someone can play an innings like that, it would be a huge, huge positive for Sri Lanka to take forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been talking about it a lot on this podcast, haven't we? About those support roles becoming leading roles. And we've seen a few instances of promise, particularly from players like Harshita Samaravikrama, who've batted well. I think Kavisha Dilhari is very highly rated and is someone who the management looks at as someone who has leadership potential and also who could take the batting and the bowling forward. But you've got to see those big performances, particularly, I think these are the crunch series that they need to perform, right? Coming up against a team like the West Indies, who hasn't been in ODI cricket a huge performer in the last few years. And Sri Lanka is a team that's kind of coming up. So they're kind of on equal footing, right? And you want to see players who don't usually have that leading role coming to the fore. I think if you look at the Sri Lankan team, it's also very spin heavy, like Santoki mentioned about the West Indies side, right? But at the same time, you've got players like Udeshika Prabodhini who've been there for ages and have kept doing the job as that sometimes the lone quick in the side, right? So they'll be expected, I think, to put in a big performance here because Sri Lanka have a really tough challenge ahead of them if they want to make it to the to the World Cup automatically. They've um, according to this tweet I got from Krishna Kumar on Twitter, Sri Lanka would need 5 wins out of the 6 games they played. So they've got 3 against the West Indies and 3 against Ireland. So it's not going to be easy. If they do put in a good performance against West Indies, obviously that'll go a long way into taking them into the World Cup. Um, Sadoki, a bit of a a wider question. 5 automatic spots for the World Cup, what are we talking about here, right? 6 teams make it through automatically. India obviously um, as hosts, but just 5 spots up for grabs for other teams.
Yeah, it's tough conditions, and I think West Indies are. I think we've got 3 more games against Bangladesh, so
Mm.
it's tough. It adds extra spice, extra context to this series against Sri Lanka, and it's really interesting hearing you guys talk about the Sri Lanka women's side because, as you said, there are parallels not only between Athapaththu and Mathews, but also from what you're saying, the experience of the side having an aging squad. West Indies as well. That's been one sort of critique. A lot of our players are in their 30s and mid 30s, so again, longer term questions with our side, especially looking towards that 2025 World Cup, is if we qualify, how are we going to embed younger players? Where are we getting our younger talent? Last year they set up Cricket West Indies set up the first ever women's academy for players who have performed at under 19 level to sort of develop. So again, it also links to longer term issues with West Indies women's side in terms of we've got this experienced side, but they're now get all collectively moving towards the end of their career. So how are we going to integrate younger players? And that'll be going forward beyond the Sri Lanka series. Interesting to see how they do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one step in the right direction, but it does feel like even in Sri Lanka, right? Uh, that those steps are coming very slowly. And sometimes a lot of the other teams are leaving them behind in that aspect, right, where they've got a lot more big tournaments going. The West Indies did have a CPL for the
Yeah.
women, but Sri Lanka still don't have a franchise tournament for the women. So that's another area that they'll need to make strides in if they want to keep competing. So we've spoken about the ODIs and why this ODI series is going to be important for both teams. West Indies could seal their spot in the World Cup, or Sri Lanka could, take one step towards that. Um, just the T20s now with the World Cup coming up ahead in Bangladesh. Um, what what can you tell us about this T20 squad, Santoki, in terms of, do they have a settled squad, or are they still looking for players who can fulfill certain roles? And are we likely to see some kind of experimentation within the team?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the T20 series against Pakistan wasn't really a test for us. It was pretty much straightforward win. So on the flip side, we weren't really challenged. So I think we'll carry on with a settled side based on that Pakistan series. But we haven't really had a challenge this year. Again, we West Indies women's side don't really play that many games before the Pakistan series.
Mm.
That our last series, I mean, it's probably a problem with a lot of sides, international sides at the moment. In the women's game, our last series before that was Australia, which was 6-7 months before that. So
Yeah.
in a sense, we're kind of forced to use our settle team because we don't have enough games to sort of test out who can perform and who not. Our middle order, there are some questions. We've got young Zayda James in at the moment, who's a talent for the future. That's someone who we're trying to get up to the standards. But again, the T20 series, I think you're going to see again. It's going to be the Hayley Mathews show if we are going to perform in that series. It's just the nature of her game, the way she plays, she's always going to grab the headline. So I think again, the key is going to be Hayley Mathews if she can perform. But I do think, as you sort of alluded to earlier, T20 cricket is our stronger format at the moment. We do have in a one-on-one game, as we saw against Australia in the T20
Yeah.
series in October, we can post big totals when everyone comes together. I think in the 50 over game, we find it slightly harder to build and construct the innings. But in the T20 format, I think we can challenge anyone. So I'm looking forward to this World Cup in Bangladesh to see what we can produce.
Yeah, Nick, on that same note, right? Sri Lanka have obviously been on a kind of an upward trend in the last couple of years. They've had some really good results in England, in South Africa as well. And then when New Zealand came over, this World Cup, is it their best opportunity to get into the semifinals? Because as you've mentioned before, Athapaththu is alluded to retirement many many times in the last couple of months, and even if it's not this year, it's coming, right? It's close by. So how important do you think this World Cup is, and you know is this their best chance to make it into a semi?
I think it's certainly as good a chance as they've had thus far. Not only when you look at the form Chamari's in, but also the conditions in Bangladesh, which are going to be really helpful to this team, right? When you think of the spin-heavy attack, the slow and low wickets, which aren't a million miles away from what the team's been used to batting on in Sri Lanka. So yeah, I think this is a huge, huge opportunity, and I see this series as a really good yardstick of where Sri Lanka are at. I think both these teams are actually a little bit underrated. And I'm excited to see if we're gonna see a sort of a young player break through and really take that step during this series. Santoki touched on Kiana Joseph and Zayda James, who I'm both pretty excited about from a West Indian perspective. And yeah, likewise, there's lots of younger girls in the Sri Lanka side, right? And maybe, I don't know, you'll know better than me, Estelle, but could we see Shashini unleashed again for the T20s?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting one, right? Because she was at the qualifiers. Um, and it's interesting because, you know, there's one thing about Sri Lanka cricket is they seem to unearth a lot of these unorthodox players. Um, and it seems to happen in kind of really random ways, right? Shashini Gimhani was spotted in the nets during some kind of opening ceremony for a nets facility, right? And then invited to come to the high performance center, and from there she goes on to play in the qualifiers for Sri Lanka. So I'd be interested to see if they actually test her. They haven't picked her in the ODI squad, but the T20 team is still hasn't been named, so it'll be interesting to see if they do go with her. Just on the conditions and stuff, I mean, I've been seeing a lot of scores from Bangladesh coming in where there have been some high scoring games, right? uh, and this series, all 6 games are going to be played at one venue. As a visiting team, Santoki, you do you see that as an advantage?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think, especially with not much preparation time, at least you'll have a time to kind of get settled in and kind of get used to the ground. On the flip side, conditions will deteriorate, so it'll be interesting to see how the pitch plays match to match. But I think for a visiting side, it definitely gives the advantage of not having to travel to different grounds and getting used to a pitch very, very quickly. So I think that swings a slight advantage towards us in this series.
Nick, any thoughts on that? Because we've seen this a lot, right? I mean, during COVID, it was understandable, and a lot of the games were played at single venues, even for the men. Uh, but it's obviously a clear advantage that a home team has, is that the conditions are more familiar to them than it is to the visiting team, right? But when you play everything in one venue, are you giving away something really critical to a team, particularly in a situation where the results of these games are really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it would have been a greater advantage to Sri Lanka to mix things up a bit, and that you can take the visiting team to venues that they've got no idea how they're going to play, right? Like, you can take them to the Pisara, you can take them to the Colts, you can take them up to Kandy, and they've literally got no idea what kind of tracks they're going to get. I would have thought, as Santoki said, the wickets Hamantoto get more spin friendly the more they're played on, but I guess you'll start to get a grip with things. I still don't really know what to expect from Hambantota wickets. They seem sometimes to really favour batting, and then we've also seen some very low scores. Their teams being bowled out for sub-100 totals. But one thing which is great is it's a pretty cricket-starved part of the country, right? And since this ground was built, it hasn't exactly done what it was supposed to do. And so I hope that we see crowds, and I think it's kind of a really good yardstick for where women's cricket is in terms of public perception in Sri Lanka as to whether people come to watch. And I really hope that they do turn out in numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one reason that I could think of about them having it in Hambantota is because there's been really bad weather around the country. So I suppose the ODIs were originally planned to be played at Galle. I suppose the weather was one reason why they shifted to Hambantota. But you're right; it is a venue that sees a bit of crowds coming in for the men's game. Hopefully, we see a few coming in for these as well, particularly because of the interest created by the team in the last couple of years, right? I mean, at this point, the discourse around the women's team is as big as I've seen ever, right? Following the series against South Africa, even now people are still talking about them. And the best part is, even on socials, I see a lot of discussion about other women's teams, which is not something that was prevalent, maybe even 3 years ago. So that's a great step forward. I think, like you mentioned, it's a good yardstick to measure how the game is growing, the women's game is growing in Sri Lanka, to see the crowds. I think we can go into now the worst part of the discussion, the predictions. Um, we're going for the ODIs first, because if you look at the two teams, Sri Lanka didn't even play the last World Cup, right? They didn't qualify because of the qualifiers were disrupted by COVID, and they didn't get a chance to play those, and ended up not going to New Zealand. West Indies had a couple of upsets in that tournament, so they'll be a bit wary, but they'll want to go in automatically. Sri Lanka won't want to kind of risk having to go to the qualifier. So it's a big series, like I've mentioned before. What are your predictions for the ODIs? Let's go to Santoki first.
Well, the ODI, like I said, it's our weaker format, but I'm going to back the Windies. I think it'll be a nail biter 2-1. 2-1 win to the West Indies in the ODI side.
Nick?
I am going to go 2-1 Sri Lanka. I was going to go 1-1 with one rained off, but that's a complete cop-out. So no, I'll go 2-1 Sri Lanka. I think the girls' spin attack is going to be hard to play. They might get Hayley Mathews for a couple of low ones and, yeah, just sneak past.
Yeah, see, that's the big thing about both teams, right? Like we've discussed before. Hayley, Mathews and Chamari Athapaththu obviously going to be massive wickets. And once, if both, either team who is able to take those wickets early, it could really shift the game in their favor. T20s, West Indies are, I mean, Santoki says it's the stronger format. Uh, so he's going 3-0.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know if you heard the breaking news, but West Indies are back, so we're gonna take that 3-0 in the T20 series, no doubt.
Nick, what do you think?
My Jamaican mother will be appalled if I go Sri Lanka in both series, so I will go 2-1 Windies. But I think that's going to be a close series too. I think, yeah, Sri Lanka will take a game in style.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to identify what Sri Lanka's strong format is, but they have had a couple of big series wins over the last couple of years in T20 cricket. So I think it should be a really evenly matched series. I'm very excited to see the likes of Hayley Mathews, Stephanie Taylor in action in Sri Lanka. We haven't seen them, I think, since 2017. If I'm not mistaken, they weren't in the previous cycle for Sri Lanka. So this will be a big series. I'm sure both teams are really familiar with each other. So if you've made it this far in the podcast, thanks for listening. I'm just going to run down the things that you can follow and, comment on. So we've got obviously the podcast. You can find us on YouTube if you type in the Murali Pod or the Murali End. You can follow us on any podcast platform that you get your podcasts. We've got a newsletter out as well, so you can check that out. We've got all the links listed below. Santoki, you want to shout out any of your platforms?
Yeah, so you can follow Caribbean Cricket Podcast, YouTube, audio, all audio platforms, social media, and thank you guys for having me on the Murali Pod. Big fans of your work, Estelle, or your podcast work. Nick, writing one of the great. I've actually got it here. One of
No
the great
way.
cricketing books. I actually took it on holiday last year, and
Oh, I'm
Customs
sorry,
searched my
man. That must have weighed down your
yeah,
luggage.
and also Customs like searched the book because they were like, no way is someone reading a 500-page book on Sri Lankan cricket. He must be hiding something in this book.
Amazing.
And if you guys, whoever is listening, we also have another interesting crossover because Santoki's got Sri Lankan blood
Yeah.
and Nick's got Caribbean blood. So interesting pairing to come together on this podcast. If you made it this far, thanks again for listening. We'll be back again with some disappointing, disappointing discussions on the men's team, probably in the next couple of days. But thanks for listening. This is Estelle Vasudevan, and you've been listening to the Murali Pod.